Hey friends, today we're going to talk about using illustration markers properly. There are lots of different types of illustration markers. There's Prismacolor, there are just the Blick Studio markers. All of them are meant for illustration. So they're alcohol-based markers, and they usually always have two different tips. So they're going to have a finer tip on one side, and then a bit bolder tip on the other side. And these markers are meant to be used in a very specific way, and I want to show that to you. And they're also meant to be layered, um, both with other markers. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to show you how to add a second media of colored pencil on top of some of your marker shading to add a little bit more detail. So the first thing you always want to do when working with illustration markers is make sure you test your colors and make sure you really know what they look like. So I've got an extra piece of paper underneath here, and I'm just going to test some of these colors. So I'm going to just kind of lay a little bit down just so I'm sure what they look like, because sometimes the colors that they show on the sticker don't accurately match what the color actually looks like once you put it down on paper. So I'm just kind of getting some sample colors here that I think I might use for this drawing. So what I've got here is an anime style cartoon drawing that I've already done in pencil first, and then I went over that with some black marker. And now I'm going to show you how you work with the illustration markers. So for the hair, I'm going to do some blonde hair here. So I'm going to start with my bigger tip, my chisel tip for this. And the trick with illustration markers is to go in one direction and try your best to do that in one kind of sweeping motion. What you don't want to do with illustration markers is you don't want to be coloring back and forth a lot like this. That's not really how they're meant to be used. So you want to try to use them in one kind of sweeping motion, covering up as much of that area as you can. And then, of course, you're going to go back in a minute, and you're going to add another layer that's going to give some dimension. But for right now, I just want to make sure I get a nice, even yellow layer here for the hair. Now, illustration markers are basically pigment or ink, and then they have alcohol. So like rubbing alcohol is what keeps them moving. And then they also dry fairly quickly because alcohol dries very quickly. And then it would not come up again if you wet it. So that's kind of the benefit of alcohol markers. Now, if you have one that's starting to go on its way out, a great way to kind of recharge that marker is if you just dip the tip of it very slightly in some clean rubbing alcohol. That will kind of help your marker last a little bit longer. So as you can see, I've got this nice kind of base of yellow down. Now I'm going to give that a second to dry, and then I'm going to use the exact same yellow and add a second layer of detail using the same exact marker. So that's one way that you can shade with illustration markers. Now there's other ways by using two different shades of a color, which I'm going to show you here in a minute. But for now, we're going to stick to just how you add shading with one color. And we're going to do the exact same thing when it comes to the skin for this one. So we can get started here on the skin. So of course, I checked out my skin tone and made sure that it was what I wanted. It was working and all that. So you'll see again how I'm trying really hard to get nice, clean lines. And it's always good to start off with the bigger side of your marker. And then of course you may have areas like the eyeballs, for example, where you're gonna need that smaller side. But for now, what I'm trying to do is just lay one even layer. Now, if I start going over that same layer, that's gonna add another layer of shading in certain areas and not in others. So for this first layer, I'm really trying to not overlap very much and just kind of get a nice layer down. It's also really important that whatever you used as your black marker, whether it was a Sharpie or a Micron pen, that is not being picked up by your marker, so you want to be very careful when you get close to those areas. Certain black outlining markers will pick up a lot when you get close with your illustration markers, and others, like Sharpies and Microns, tend to be pretty good about not picking it up, but it all depends. So again, these are things that you want to test out on scrap paper before you even get started. And one thing that artists will sometimes do is on the piece of art they're working on, they'll leave themselves a little edge, and then they'll use the same edge here to just check and test their colors. And then when they're finished with their piece of art, they just kind of cut that little test area off of it. So they had a spot to test all their colors and make sure that the things were working the way they wanted them to. And then when I get over here by the nose area, that's where I'm going to want to keep it the lightest, because in shading, when you're shading a face, we know that the nose is the thing that sticks out the most, right? So we want to keep that nice and light. All right. Then if for any reason your marker seems to get a little bit dirty on the tip, which can happen, a great way to clean it is just on a scrap paper to just kind of get off some of that extra marker or pen or whatever it was picking up. All right, so we're going to go back to the hair now, and we're going to add a second layer of detail. So I'm going back to my exact same yellow marker that I used earlier. And now this time, I'm going to add a second layer of yellow close to the part and in areas where I feel like it would be a little darker. So maybe on the edges, it would be darker. And you'll notice it's subtle. It's not crazy. It's not like a ton of shading. It's just very, very subtle. And you'll notice this is kind of what those cartoon artists will do when they just want to have a little bit of shading to show that they understand shading, but that shading really isn't the full point of their art there. So I might add a little bit within the streaks here. And then I kind of missed these areas earlier, which were his little sideburns. That should be blonde as well. And then in this case, most likely, if the person had blonde hair, they'd probably have blonde-ish eyebrows. So I'm going to do that as well. I'm going to do this one. All right. So the next thing I'm going to show you is a pretty cool technique when using illustration markers. So what I've got here is I've got a very, very light gray marker. I also have two different shades of blue, and I'm going to work on making some really cool eyes, particularly in this drawing because it's anime style. Eyes are usually the focal point of anime, so I want to make the eyes in this drawing really, really beautiful. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the gray marker. And now for this process, you have to work kind of quickly. So I might even recommend opening up the other markers and getting ready, even though that's not something you want to get into a habit of doing because you don't ever want to leave your markers and let them dry out. But for this particular process, you'll want to be able to quickly grab them. And I'm using the fine points for all of them because this eye area is so small. So first thing I'm going to do with this very, very light gray is I'm just really going to saturate that area with some light gray. Then I'm going to grab my two different types of blue. And it's almost like working with wet on wet watercolor. So you want to do it real quick while that light gray is still wet. And what I did is I came in with two different blues and just added lines coming off to kind of give that feeling of the colored part of your eye that kind of sometimes has those lines in it. So while it's still really wet, I'm going in real quick, one color, and real quick with the other color. And it's kind of a really nice effect. Then, if I wanted to, I could go back over it with that light gray marker, and it will just kind of help blend it even more. So it'll just kind of blend all of those colors together real quick. Now that might make your light gray marker's tip a little bit dirty, but that's okay. You can clean it off just on a scrap paper. And that's another technique using illustration markers that's kind of cool and kind of gives a nice blend of a couple of different colors.